So I guess I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about governments and taking on risk. I guess with this, gales of creative destruction, it's assuming that these companies are taking on the risks, so therefore they deserve to reap the rewards. But obviously more and more governments are sort of encouraging research and development, but then aren't reaping any of the rewards.
Absolutely,
so they're taking all the risk and then getting no benefits from it. So I just wondered if you could maybe talk a bit about that and what you think can be done so risk can be sort of spread more evenly.
I have quite a bit more to say about this in my lecture in industrial policy, but the US government, for example, it has spent huge amount of money and taken a huge amount of risk in developing all these frontier technologies, especially from the end of the Second World War. So, especially during the Cold War between the 1950s and 80s, the US federal government was financing, depending on the year, between 50 and 70% of total research and development of the country. And in supposedly state-dominated economies of Japan and Korea, this ratio was barely 20%. So actually, the US government was pouring in huge amount of money developing these frontier technologies, which then the private sector ran with. So actually, virtually all the areas where the US has technological technological leadership today, computer, semiconductors, aircraft technology, GPS, you name it, internet. These were all initially created by the funding from the US Ministry of Defense or branches of US military. Semiconductor, unbeknownst to most people, was initially totally funded by the US Navy. So, as you point out, however, does the government get the thanks? Does it get the money back? No. The ideology is such that these the contributions of the government in the most difficult stages is quietly ignored, and that you extol the virtue of the entrepreneurship and innovation in the Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley wouldn't have existed without defense research funding from the US government. In a lot of countries, green technologies, from solar panel to wind to tidal power, these have all been developed with huge subsidies and risk-taking by the government. And then now, a lot of private sector companies are reaping the gains. This is a very, very problematic situation, because the private sector gets all these gains from research and other things done by the government, risk-taking and so on, funded by the taxpayers. And then when it can stand on its own feet, begins to hector the government for being inefficient, holding things back, and they complain about the business environment, the corporation taxes. We need to have a proper discussion about this, because in especially today's modern economy, your productivity is collectively determined. It's not just you. However clever you may have been as the founder of Facebook or whatever, you are standing on the shoulders of giants, which have been reared by the taxpayers, government officials, politicians. So really, we need to change our understanding of how innovation works in modern economies, and properly acknowledge contributions that different people have made. The government, taxpayers, workers, researchers. It's not all down to these one or two geniuses who, unfortunately, we believe are the people driving the world.
I have a question regarding layers of government. So I felt that your talk was mainly about nation states and the level within nation states. And I completely agree with your critique on the government failure approach, that it is not really incorporating the failure of markets as well. So I have a comment how probably could be possible to kind of notch this government failure approach to be more radical. So my question is that you talked about the lack of resources that might lead within this approach to government failure, right? So my question is, how does the government failure approach answers the source of this lack? Because especially when we look at developing countries, a lot of time higher layered governments such as WTO regulations or bilateral trade agreements, they literally lead to an excessive costs of implementing social welfare policies, right? So when we talk about, I don't know, adopting medical structures or, for example, regulating free trade when it comes to infant industries and stuff, there is an additional cost, especially of violating WTO costs and, I don't know, being at risk of being like sued in front of global legal structures. So the question is, if we see that there is a lack of resources, it might be that governments face an additional cost because they're being sued and because they're being embedded in global governments.
No, you're very right. I mean, the newly established global economic order since the 1990s, 1990s, it has made life far more difficult for developing country governments than before. You know, for one thing, for example, in the 1980s and 90s, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank insisted on the radical trade liberalization in developing countries. Now that itself was a problem because a lot of these industries that were liberalized were not ready. But even ignoring that problem, it had huge negative impact on the tax revenues of developing countries. Because the trouble is that tariffs are the easiest taxes to collect. Okay, there are some countries with long porous borders, and it's a different story for them. But for most countries, you can actually collect a lot of tariffs if you basically control a few main ports and entry points. Whereas if you want to collect income taxes, it requires a huge bureaucracy. So actually, in many developing countries, tariffs that used to account for more than 50% of the tax revenue. Even today, there are some countries where it is the case. But when you so radically liberalize trade, the government lost huge chunk of its revenue. And actually, in the mid-2000s, the IMF itself, through a working paper, admitted that this is a big mistake, because they figured out that developing country government recovered only about 1/3 of lost tax revenue from trade liberalization. So you cut their tax revenue by, I don't know, the half, and then you expect them to run a good government. Another thing that you mentioned, the WTO regime, yes, for example, it contains this TRIPS agreement, so-called the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, which demand that developing countries respect intellectual property rights of basically rich country corporations to the same extent that they are respected in their own countries. And this has hugely increased the cost of medicine and thereby crippling the public health system in many countries. And for example, when this regime was just being put in place, it was still possible because there were some countries which legally could produce copy drugs because they accepted only process patent but not product patent in chemical substances. So, for example, there was a big controversy in the early 2000s when the South African government was trying to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis by importing copy drugs from countries like India, Thailand, and Brazil. Their view was, if we pay the full price to Swiss, British, American pharmaceutical companies, it takes between $10,000 and $12,000 to keep one HIV positive patient alive per year. If we did that with these coffee drugs imported from Brazil and India, we could do it with $300 to $500. Yeah, so there's a national crisis with HIV/AIDS. We have to do this. Yeah? And then something like 30 pharmaceutical companies from advanced countries took the South African government to the constitutional court of the country, arguing that they are fundamentally infringing on our property rights. I mean, this caused a huge scandal, and the drug companies had to back down and offer big discounts and so on. But this shows how that this is going to be very, very costly to developing countries. I mean, HIV/AIDS got a bit of reprieve there because it was such a high-profile thing. But there are a lot of other drugs which could be produced much more cheaply if you didn't have to pay for all this kind of royalties through the patent system. So yes, I mean that without realizing, perhaps with realizing what they are doing, the rich countries have put in place these systems which make the finances of developing country government very, very difficult. Trade liberalization, intellectual property rights, where are they going to get the money to run a good government?
Well, so you made the point that there's a need for pluralism to broaden our understanding of the state. So when pluralism not only entails economic theory or diversity of economic theory, also entails interdisciplinarity. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering what the theory of the state can gain from other disciplines.
I didn't have time to cover that in this lecture, but for example, there is a big debate in economics on the ethics of state intervention. So there you are drawing mainly from philosophy, but also from some aspects of the political sciences. So there's this the view which is usually adopted by these supporters of government failure argument, known as the contractarian view. So basically this view says the state exists only because there's a social contract that people made to agree to give up some of their freedom so that we have order in society. I mean, this ultimately draws from the idea of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. State only exists as a product of individual contract. So the individuals are the ultimate sovereign, and therefore, ideally, unless you have unanimous agreement between all individuals in the society, the government shouldn't intervene. I mean, of course, advocates of this view are realistic enough not to think that there will be unanimity, but I mean, that's the ideal that you are supposed to strive towards. So anything that deviates from it is already morally suspect. I mean, there are other aspects of the debate on state intervention on the individual autonomy, which also draws from philosophy. So some people believe that it is necessary for the society through the government as this kind of the collective executive body to tell people how to behave. So don't eat too much sugar, don't eat too much fatty food, You cannot advertise for children's toys on TV. Others argue that this is unwarranted paternalism. This is an infringement on the individual autonomy, and therefore that you cannot have things like this. I mean, if people want to do things that harm themselves, as far as they don't harm other people, they should be allowed to. So, I mean, we cannot go into that debate, but these debates, I mean, the underlying philosophy of the state intervention, what is the state? What is it ethically acceptable to do. I mean, these things have been debated, and they draw on various aspects of moral philosophy and the political sciences. So yes, I mean, this is an area where that kind of interdisciplinarity is very much warranted. You know?
You basically showed this graph which shows the increase in GDP of the state basically over time.
Yeah.
And the implicit assumption, or the explicit assumption you made from that, was that the state is correcting for economic or for free markets inefficiencies essentially. So you're saying that the reason behind that graph is economic. But following on from what we just said there is certain schools of thought, for example, would say that the state's main role is for its own self-maintenance. And could that graph not only be showing anything economic, like being better at allocating resources, but could also just be purely a facet of the state increasing its stake within society for its own maintenance?
Well, it's both. Yeah, I mean, of course, that you cannot tell from these aggregate figures without looking at the particular history of each country and the particular actions that were taken by leading politicians and interest groups at various points of time in that history. How much of this is responding to the economic needs, and how much of it is the self-perpetuating logic of the bureaucracy of the politicians. Yes, I mean, I'm very happy to admit that quite a bit of it would be from there, because even though in extreme forms these government failure arguments are unacceptable, in milder forms, I think they make a lot of sense. I mean, you witness a lot of cases where unnecessary agencies are created basically because of turf war between different departments. You see some cities getting so-called international airports where there are 2 international flights every week and running huge losses because the politician representing that city is powerful and so on. So yes, I mean, I'm sure there are some of those, but unless you really go deep into the history and political economy of individual country, you cannot tell how much of it is this and how much of it is that. And also that when we say economic needs, I mean, what is economic needs also depends on your economic theory, your view on what is a good society, and so on. Yeah? So, a lot of Americans think that the welfare state is a bad idea. A lot of Europeans that think it is a good idea. When people, I mean, rightly or wrongly, don't want it, there's no economic need to provide it. So, I mean, what needs that these governments have been responding to, I mean, that has to be looked at more closely.
So my question is kind of following from that as well. It's not really a secret, though we don't really talk about it much in economics, that most of the theory that we're reading is coming from a very particular place, like geographical, from the US, from Western Europe, or from usually white men, middle class, whatever. So I guess my question is, following this with like the historical specificity of different developments in different countries in economics, is it even possible to like grasp the role of the state within economics on a universal abstract level? Like the theories that we have now that are coming from such a particular space, can they even be applied to so-called developing economics? I mean, we've seen it with the IMF and financial liberalization, and that would be good. With that state should do this in this economy to develop, yada yada. Is that is it a possibility?
Yes, you're right. I mean, this is why we need to broaden economics, not just in terms of theoretical perspectives, but in terms of historical time span and the geographical coverage. I mean, last year there was this event in Cambridge where I teach on so-called decolonizing the curriculum. And yeah, there were all these students from other departments talking about the need to teach more authors from developing countries and teach more perspectives from other countries and so on. And yeah, listening to it, I kind of half jokingly said that, well, unfortunately, in the economics department, students are fighting to learn about more dead white males because you're not even teaching a whole set of dead white males. Yeah, it's only a very particular group of dead white males. So if you want to learn more about Marx or the Keynes, or you are calling for more dead white males. Yeah? So the economics is even narrower than the other subjects in that regard. But yes, I mean, I think the fundamental problem is that economics has this pretense of being a universal science. And therefore, people have been trained in a way that really kind of marginalizes the role of the history and political economy in the understanding of a particular society. Also, they have been not exposed to these differences in the worldviews and values and ethics. Yeah, so take the case of the individual. You know, in a lot of places, people don't think of themselves as an individual. They are always member of some community. Maybe it's the extended family, maybe it's a region, maybe it's a country, but you know, the idea that we are individuals itself is a product of the European capitalism. I'm not saying that it's therefore necessarily wrong, but you have to recognize that that's only one particular way of seeing ourselves. Yeah? But then you, on that assumption, build a whole theoretical edifice, and then trying to apply it to other places is going to be problematic. Also, mainstream economists of today have forgotten history. They are not taught history. I mean, there are relatively few economics departments that even teach European American economic history. Not to speak of history of imperialism, colonialism, and dominance of the rest of the world by the Europeans and North Americans. So, you know, and also that not knowing this history, people from rich countries do not realize how rubbish their countries were when they were at the level of today's developing countries. I mean, I some years ago wrote this book, Kicking Out the Ladder, part of which showed how much that interventionist policies that today's rich countries used in order to develop their economies in the early days. But another part of the book showed how low quality their institutions were when they were at the level of today's developing countries in economic terms. So this gives them the confidence coming out of ignorance to morally lecture today's developing countries. And also that there is no recognition that a lot of problems in today's developing countries are the creations of the rich countries in the past. We could spend the whole 12 lectures talking about this, but I think you are right. I mean, we need to recognize that, I mean, even kind of so-called heterodox theories that are taught today in most places, they are very Eurocentric perspectives. Yeah, and some of these people are frankly racist themselves. I mean, Friedrich List, who developed the infant industry argument, first invented by Alexander Hamilton, openly said that this theory does not apply to tropical countries. So it was only for the Europeans, basically. Any theory comes from a particular historical, intellectual, ethical background, and try to understand those. And when you are trying to apply it to societies with very different history and perspectives, you have to make due adjustments to that.
So I'm curious about your view on the role of like social entrepreneurship in government intervention, because it's seen as, among many definitions, like two being either a way to innovate in the public sector and the government sector, or a way to like harness the power of the private sector for social change. So I'm just curious, like how you see social entrepreneurship as a mechanism for.
What is your definition of social entrepreneurship? Yeah.
The two here are like a way to innovate in the government sector, or as a way to harness the power of the private sector to enact social change. So, and then the social change being a more powerful government sector.
Entrepreneurship initially was invented for just the business enterprises, but yes, I mean, insofar as it involves bringing new ideas, reorganizing things, I mean, it can be applied to social changes. And I discussed in my lecture on inequality how societies with high inequality, for example, can have this inbred elite which are going to be engaged in groupthink and do not innovate, especially in terms of social arrangements. So yes, I'm very much with you in believing that you need a deliberate attempt to change social arrangements through broadly defined innovation. Yeah? But saying that you need social innovation, I mean, it really needs to be discussed at two levels. Yeah? One is, well, usually the level that we talk about it and very amenable to neoclassical economics, which is to accept the existing distribution of income, wealth, and power as given, and then seeking improvements within that structure. So this is summarized in neoclassical economics as an idea of Pareto improvement. Yeah? How do you make some people better off without making anyone worse off? Yeah? It's the important principle that we need in order to defend individual rights against the tyranny of the majority. But let's face it, it is inherently conservative because it's not going to say that you can make some people worse off to make other people better off. So this keeps you from asking questions about things like land reform or creating lots of public housing and things like that. So you have to recognize that bias. At the deeper level, we can and should also talk about social changes by changing the fundamental arrangements about power relationships and income and wealth distribution. But yeah, these are far more difficult to confront, and if you don't manage them well, it can create a lot of problems. So we have to be careful with that. But we need to look at both levels. I mean, in this context, my favorite quote is from this Brazilian bishop called Dom Helder Camara, who was one of the leaders of the so-called liberation theology, this left-wing Catholic theology that was very popular in Latin America between the 1950s and 70s. Some of the extreme members of it even advocated armed struggle against the unjust social order that goes against the teaching of the Bible. But I mean, Camara wasn't such a radical person, but he once said that when I give food to poor people, people call me a saint. Yeah? When I ask why these people do not have enough to eat, they call me a communist. Yeah, I think that as trained social scientists, we should all become a bit of a communist, not entirely. Because you, while striving to make improvements within the given structure, you also need to ask questions about the structure. Recognizing that changing that structure is going to be much more difficult. Recognizing that sometimes doing something within the given structure can make the changes at the deeper level easier, but you have to ask the questions at both levels. Unfortunately, neoclassical economics doesn't encourage you to ask the second level of questions. So studying other schools. I mean, especially the Marxist school and the institutionalist school, which ask questions about this underlying structure. I think is going to be very helpful in understanding this aspect.